All right, so while people are joining us for today's event, let me remind you of the events at the center for the rest of the academic year. Today is a penultimate talk, in fact, of the center. Next week will be the last talk given by Clark Glimmour on Tuesday in person at noon. You can also, if you want, watch the talk online. Um, um, this weekend, we are hosting the last conference organized by the Center, Evidence-Based Medicine Reconsidered, which is a conference organized by the Senior Visiting Fellow, Karl Hofer. On Friday, there is no lunchtime talk, but I want to mention two talks at 10 a.m. at the center in person without Zoom. John Worrell will be giving a lecture for 1 hour. And at 3:30, Jeff Barrett from Irvine will also be giving a lecture on algorithmic complexity. So we have two talks on Friday, 10 a.m. at the center, 3:30 on the 10th floor in the Cathedral of Learning. Both talks are in person only. So today it's my pleasure to reintroduce Sam Fletcher, which I've already done at least once and maybe more than once. I don't quite remember. Sam was a fellow at the center a few years ago, and his talk today is part of the feature form of fellows, where we are bringing back philosophers who have spent time at the center. Currently, Sam is at the University of Oxford. He is professor of philosophy. He's also at Merton College as a fellow. He was formerly at the University of Minnesota in the Department of Philosophy. He works, I mean, many of you know his work. He works in the philosophy of physics and has published widely in this area. I will just mention Foundations of General Relativity, which was published last year. It's one of the short elements published by Cambridge. You can find it online. I'm not sure it's still freely accessible.
It is, in fact, I paid some very dear cash to make it gold open access.
So no reason not to download it because it's even free now. But Sam's work is not limited to the philosophy of physics. I mean, as we were talking earlier offline, one of the things with Sam is that he works on really many different topics. And one of the many things I really like with his work is the diversity of his interests. He does general philosophy of science, has published widely on explanation and idealizations. He also does philosophy of statistics, has work published recently on the stopping rule, for example. In addition, he has a grant called A Modern Philosophy for Classical Statistical Testing and Estimation, which is over next year, I suppose. And I think one of the outcomes was a new measure of statistical evidence that you had committed yourself to produce. He also has done some important work on meta science and on issues around the methodology of the sciences, including the social sciences. He has interest on computation and physical computation. So, as you can see, a very large set of interest in philosophy. And today, the topic will be quantum biology, which is at least for me, struck me as a new area of interest for Sam, but we shall see. Sam, Flo, thanks to join us again, and it's a really great pleasure to have you back. And floor is yours.
Great. Thank you very much, Edouard. So this particular topic, well, how should I say? I got interested in it a few years ago because I had seen a few talks on this topic, and but not from philosophers, from physicists, mostly, who are interested in certain kinds of explanations in biology that seem like they involve quantum physics. Now, the question that I'm interested in is I'm interested in trying to in characterizing exactly what quantum biology is, or maybe perhaps what it ought to be. So this particular question, therefore, is a kind of question in general philosophy of science. Despite the name quantum biology, we'll have a little bit of quantum, little bit of biology, but I think that the question that I'm interested in regarding it is mostly within the ambit of the general philosophy of science. everyone agrees that quantum biology is some kind of transdisciplinary research field, and it's characterized by something, and people give various answers to this. I will get to some of those proposed answers first, but to motivate why we would care about this and to motivate where the answers are coming from, I think it's really best to start with an example. So the example involves birds, in particular, the migratory behavior of birds. Here we have the European robin and a depiction of where it lives during different points in time in the year. Now, there are different populations of European robins. The ones in the purple typically don't engage in too much migratory behavior, but the ones in the kind of salmon colored areas and the blue colored areas do migrate, and they tend to migrate north. Um, in the warmer months and south in the colder ones. Now, and the question arises about how these birds actually successfully migrate because it's not just that they go in some random direction. Rather, it seems that they are quite good at navigating from a nesting place in the north to one in the south, year on and year out. And when they do their migration, they often do it along areas or periods, as you can see around the Mediterranean Ocean, where there aren't a lot of landmarks that they could use visually. So, bird behavior scientists, ecologists, and others are interested in the question of how they go about doing this. Now, the thing that's very interesting about these particular birds, not all birds have this feature, but these particular birds, is that it's believed that they use various different mechanisms for navigation. It's a system where they don't rely on any particular mechanism, but several in combination. They use the positioning of the sun, and in the night, they use the positioning of the stars as well. And so then learn by behavior cues about the direction they should be traveling, using the heavens. But interestingly, it seems that there's substantial evidence that these birds, among others, use somehow Earth's magnetic field for navigating. Now, the question that arises is how that's possible. How do the birds sense the Earth's magnetic field? And how do we know that they do? So here is an example of a kind of behavioral experiment that's been used to test this hypothesis. I should mention, by the way, that there's numerous different kinds of experiments and different levels of data from various sciences, both in animal behavior, in chemistry, and in physics that pertain to all the questions that we're going to be talking about here today. So for that reason, it's that of course substantiates the idea that this is a transdisciplinary research field, what we're investigating, or that this question is an example of it. But it also means that I'm not really able to review all the different experiments, the different types of data and different types of supporting evidence that scientists have for this ability of birds. So I'm just going to focus on some representative examples. So in this particular diagram here, you can see representation of the Earth and the Earth's magnetic field. And on the other side, you can see a depiction of a kind of cartoon of one of these behavior experiments. So the way that this particular type of experiment works is that these robins are temporarily captured during their migratory season and placed in an environment that is like a barn, basically. So it's a large interior open space where the birds don't have direct access to the location of the sun or to the stars. And they're placed temporarily in a kind of container, and the container, when the top is removed, allows the birds to fly out in a particular direction. And what scientists do is they measure the direction in which the birds fly. And you can see in this particular diagram a representation of some of the data from one of these experiments where the birds orient towards a particular direction in the magnetic field. One of the things that is interesting about this is that in such environments, you can also generate magnetic fields that change the natural direction of the magnetic field. Um, so, not let it be determined by Earth's field, but generate other magnetic fields in this kind of barn environment. And you see here in part B, for instance, different ways in which the magnetic field might be oriented by inducing an external magnetic field on these birds. When they do that, they find that if they reverse the polarity but keep the magnitude of the magnetic field, that the birds continue to fly off in the same direction. And that gives some indication that what the birds are sensitive to is not the field line, the direction of the field lines per se, but the orientation of the field lines towards the horizon. In particular, we see that when the orientation is reversed, as you can see in the bottom parts of the diagrams here, but the inclination magnitude is kept the same, the birds fly in the opposite direction. Whereas if the magnetic field is adjusted so that it's pointing horizontal to the horizon, the birds fly in random directions. So there's some evidence, therefore, based on these types of experiments and others, that somehow these birds really are sensing the direction of the magnetic field, and moreover, that they're using this sensing to determine which way they should travel during their migrations. Indeed, the direction indicated here is the natural direction of their migration during this particular season. So here's a proposed mechanism, first proposed in various parts during the 1970s and 1980s, but with a lot more attention in the 90s and 2000s. This particular mechanism involves a specific type of protein, which is found in the eye of these particular birds and some other birds as well, but not all birds. It's a protein called a cryptochrome. And this cryptochrome contains itself two distinct molecules. We'll call them FAD and TRIP. Um, these two molecules are positioned in such a way that within this protein, they have a special absorption line for a particular wavelength of blue light. So you can see in this diagram here, for instance, that if blue light comes in, it can induce among these two molecules an electron transfer. That electron transfer changes these two molecules into what's known in chemistry as a radical pair. These are pairs of molecules that have an extra electron. These are the radicals, and because there's two of them, it's a pair. Now, what's unusual about this case is that it's believed that when this radical pair is produced by the absorption of the blue photon, the two electrons are produced in an entangled state. It's known as a singlet state. What's important about it for our purposes is not exactly the details about what entanglement is or how it's supposed to work or how it's supposed to be interpreted, so much as it is a feature which is particular to quantum mechanics and quantum chemistry. It's a kind of feature that doesn't show up in the usual ways in classical models of molecules. So within those kind of pre-quantum models, these radical pairs wouldn't really induce very much. They wouldn't induce very any substantial changes to the chemistry that's going on in the bird's eye. But according to quantum mechanics, this particular singlet state, which is induced amongst these two molecules, the trip and fad molecules within the cryptochrome, is sensitive to magnetic fields. And in particular, there is a transition between several different quantum states of these radical pairs, between so-called singlet states and triplet states. You can see a cartoon depicting this here over here. This transition, it's not a discrete transition, it happens continuously. I'll show you an example of what I mean by that on the next slide. But the idea is that this transition between the two, the rate at which it happens is affected by the presence of a magnetic field. So in particular, the orientation of the magnetic field to these molecules is what's absolutely important. And these molecules themselves are embedded in the cells of the bird's eye, which themselves have an orientation, a specific orientation within the bird's eye relative to the horizontal. And so there is some correlated information about the orientation with the orientate of the horizon with the cells in the bird's eye, which in turn is correlated with the orientation of these cryptochromes, and therefore the orientations of the tryptophan fat molecules, and therefore the orientation of the radical pairs to the Earth's magnetic field. It so happens that after this blue light is absorbed, there's a chance that the cryptochrome molecule undergoes a chemical change to a signaling state that induces a signal in the bird's optical neurons. Now, the probability that this happens is turns out to be higher in the triplet state than in the singlet state. So any sort of process that induces more time of these cryptochrome radical pairs in a triplet state could increase the rate of the signal and therefore induce an ability of the bird to be able to see effectively its orientation with respect to the magnetic field. The idea is that the transmission along the optic nerve induces some sort of change in their visual perception, the exact nature of which is not yet known, but it's speculated to be something like they see different intensities, for instance, of blue light, or perhaps some other sort of informative overlay in their visual perception. The details of this are not known, but it does seem to be the case that the birds do adjust their orientation according according to a signal like this. So just to give a little bit of an idea about how this mechanism is supposed to work, we see here two diagrams of computer simulation models for a simplified or idealized version of the mechanism for this described here, involving the cryptochromes. In this first diagram, represented as or labeled as A, there's no external magnetic field. And what we see on the vertical axis is the probability of collapse to a triplet state. Of course, for people involved in foundations of quantum mechanics here, the collapse here needn't be an actual collapse. It could be an effective collapse induced by decoherence. None of the issues germane to the interpretation of quantum mechanics seem to be especially relevant in this particular case. Anyway, what's important though is that you can see that these green line is oscillating with a constant frequency. It's about 15 megahertz here in this particular case, and it represents the probability that one has a triplet state as opposed to a singlet state. Now, it just so happens that over time, more and more of these states collapse either into a signaling state or convert back to a non-signaling state. Once we include that mechanism, the recombination mechanism, it's sometimes called in this literature, we get the red plot here of the oscillation of the proportion of or probability of triplet states. And then finally, the blue curve indicates the accumulated reaction product. You can think of this as the accumulated signal that's produced in the optical nerve due to this particular process. Now, in B, you see an example of what happens when there's an external magnetic field that's applied. An external magnetic field whose magnitude is similar to that of the Earth. You can see what happens that in this particular case that there's an additional sinusoidal pattern that's imposed upon the proportion of triplet states, so the probability of collapse into a triplet state that is of a lower frequency, about 1/10 the frequency. And in a consequence with this is that when we add the recombination mechanism, we see a much more complicated picture in red here. What's especially important is that you see that, especially on shorter time scales and even over longer time scales, a higher accumulated reaction product. Um, so a consequence of this is that depending on the magnetic field and how much of the magnetic field is oriented in the right way with the system, there is a more rapid accumulation of of the reaction product and a larger signal within the bird's eyes. So we can see that in the total description of this, even though I've used a very idealized version, ultimately, in order to explain a certain aspect of how certain kinds of bird behavior is possible, we have to revert to the chemical structure within certain molecules, proteins in particular, in the bird's eyes, and the explanation of its behavior as a mechanism for sensitivity to magnetic fields requires invocations of quantum chemistry. Now, this is not the only example that people in quantum biology use as an example of what their subject matter is, but it's the example which is used more often. I want to give you one more example, although there are several others that are often invoked as possible topics of or subjects of quantum biology. This one I'm going to describe much more sketchily, but the idea I think is going to be clear. It has to do with the efficiency of electron transport in photosynthesis. So in this cartoon, we're imagining a situation where light is incident on the components of plants that are the light gathering molecules or complexes in the process of photosynthesis. There's typically many of these, and they're stacked together in a kind of network. When light is incident on these complexes and is harvested, what it does is it is converted, the energy of the photon is absorbed, and the energy is converted into an excitation of an electron or a small number of electrons that then is transferred among these harvesting complexes. But the place where that energy is used in photosynthesis is in a different part of the photosynthetic complex. In particular, the energy production area is typically separated, and in typical models for electron transport, it's a kind of diffusive process. The electrons diffusively and incoherently spread out amongst these harvesting complexes. The prediction of which is that only a small fraction of the electrons actually reach the energy generation complex. Um, um, but that's not what's actually found in experiments. What's actually found is that the efficiency, although it depends quite a bit on the particular plant and so on, is often above 90%, maybe sometimes in some cases even 99%. So the classical theory of incoherent electron transfer here doesn't seem to accurately describe or explain the ability of photosynthesis to be efficient in this particular way, efficient in the electron transport aspect here. And it's believed that there is that the process is going to be better explained by a quantum coherent process, one that involves constructive and destructive interference between um, the components of the wave function of these electrons that gives a peaked amplitude of them being transported to the energy harvesting complex. Now, the story here is a lot sketchier than in the bird case, and I think for the reason is that the quantum chemistry here is not as under control as it is for the bird magnetoreception case. But it's still believed that in order to be able to explain the efficiency of electron transport and photosynthesis, that quantum mechanics may need to be involved in the explanation because it's involved in the explanation of coherent transport. Okay, so now we've seen some examples of quantum biology. Um, how can we characterize in general what this field is about? We know it involves something about explanations that involve quantum mechanics. And indeed, in some scientists' own work in describing what quantum biology is supposed to be, they go directly for this sort of description about what quantum biology is. They say, for instance, in this particular review paper, quantum biology is the application of quantum theory to aspects of biology, for which classical physics fails to give an accurate description and explanation. And indeed, in the way that I've been framing a lot of these examples has been playing into the feasibility of this characterization. And as a first pass, I think this is not so bad because it does characterize in some way the features that seem to be striking about these examples. But it seems that the definition is too inclusive if you think about it for a minute. Now, we can apply quantum theory to all sorts of aspects of biology for which we don't have any classical explanation within classical physics. To give you a slightly flippant, but still think illuminating example, one of the things that is the case is that all sorts of animals and plants, because they're all composed of matter, but the usual classical theory of matter, just involving electromagnetic interactions and perhaps some others, is utterly incapable of describing the stability of matter. It's a famous problem in 19th century physics that was seen to have been largely solved in the quantum theory. There's a lot of particular details to be worked out about the stability of matter in particular cases, but it seemed to be a distinctly quantum phenomena. And yet, no one thinks that to explain why cats don't collapse in on themselves and why violets in cilantro don't immediately disperse or implode doesn't seem like it's something that we want to characterize as quantum biology, because those features seem to be generic features of not just living things, but biological things, that is, but of material things as well. So we need to have some further restriction on what we take quantum biology to be in order to appropriately characterize it. I think one of the things that's at stake in this, aside from interest among the quantum biologists who want to show that there is something legitimate about their own work, more on that in a little bit, is the way that certain kinds of research disciplines or subdisciplines are characterized. It's interesting here that it's characterized in a kind of way that involves an interface between disciplines that involves particular kinds of explanations and the inability of certain kinds of explanations to be adequate. And I think that that's rather interesting because it doesn't just characterize the subject. It's not just characterized by the subject matter, but about the kinds of explanations that can be given. So here's another take by another group of scientists. Um, on this particular take, they say that quantum biology is concerned with the following sort of question. Are there any biological systems that use quantum mechanics to perform a task that cannot be done classically or can do that task more efficiently than even the best classical equivalent? In this particular way of thinking about it, quantum biology is much more connected with what you might call a kind of engineering perspective on what the tasks of science are. The reason why I think that this is attractive to a lot of scientists is that they see the motivation, or they motivate, especially to funding agencies, the importance of quantum biology as um, a kind of pure science, the knowledge of which will give us information about how to produce better engineered materials. This is why you see this emphasis here on efficiently or on possibility. It allows us to do things if we were able to harness the same sort of biological quantum technology, or to do them more efficiently than we could do before. This is indeed the same kind of the latter in particular is the same kind of rhetoric that you hear around the importance of quantum computing as well. Now, this sort of perspective gives a kind of um, very intentional stance to the biological organisms. Of course, it's not the case that they involve intentions in any substantial sense. The plants, for instance, undergoing photosynthesis, um, um, whether they can be characterized as performing a task is perhaps at best metaphorical. And so, for this reason, this particular characterization of quantum biology, I think, also isn't adequate. Although, as I just mentioned, it does have the nice feature that it characterizes, I think, why or alludes to some of the reasons why many scientists find this subject interesting. Here's a third take by Jim Al-Khalili. He and some co-authors have been working on projects related to this and even wrote a popular book, which is very interesting on quantum biology. He says quantum biology, as we define it today, means exploring the mechanisms of phenomena that rely on non-trivial quantum effects within living cells. By non-trivial, I mean quantum tunneling, long-lived quantum coherence and superposition, quantum entanglement. These are surprising effects that we're now seeing taking place within living organisms. So I take it that the reference here to non-trivial quantum effects is supposed to be ruling out the kinds of effects which are um, generic, or the kinds of effects which, though they can be described by classical mechanics, for instance, or classical theories, that is to say, non-quantum theories of chemistry, that um, that they do so, for instance, only by approximating or idealizing what the let me start that sentence over. By non-trivial quantum effects, I take it that alkaline means effects that, even though they are described or explained by quantum theories, are not adequately explained by classical theories that the quantum theories themselves explain. And the examples that he gives are supposed to be examples that one doesn't find within classical physics. So, tunneling effects, for instance, involve particles or physical systems traveling through a potential barrier, a potential barrier being an energy barrier. Think of it like a wall that they wouldn't be able to classically, that's prohibited classically. Um, and the coherence and superposition entanglement are supposed to be characteristically quantum phenomena. That's why he's picking out these sorts of examples. Um, I think that there's something right about this as well. But I still think that it falls prey to the sorts of examples that I was giving you before, like the stability of matter. The stability characteristics just can't be explained by classical material models, or at least with not nearly the same adequacy as quantum mechanics can. So the stability of matter is therefore, I think, a highly non-trivial feature, one which is just assumed rather than explained typically within classical material models. Okay, so I think that these different ways of trying to characterize quantum biology are capturing certain aspects of it, but are too weak or too strong. They might be too specific. There's many others that scientists give, and I haven't gone through all of them, but I wanted to give you a representative sample of different ways that people try to characterize it. So here's a feature that I think which is not quite captured in the proposals that have been given before, which I do think is very important. It has to do with why certain kinds of explanations, not just descriptions, but why certain kinds of explanations are deficient classically. Why exactly the quantum mechanical explanations add to the situation. So let's look at these two situations, the two examples that we've discussed. Avian magnetoreception, right? That's the ability of the birds to be able to um, uh, navigate and sense magnetic fields and use it for navigation, and the efficiency of electron transport and photosynthesis. So in both cases, we have a biological phenomenon which seems like it needs explanation. On the one hand, we've got the avian case, where the behavioral studies establish strong evidence that these European robins, and some other birds as well, sense, in some sense, magnetic field lines or the orientation of the field lines. And in the case of photosynthetic efficiency, the biochemical analysis establishes very low electron loss from receptor to reaction center. Now, if these particular things, these sort of descriptions were adequate, then we could stop here. But what's unusual about both of these cases is that they're very atypical features for the kinds of things studied at this level of description. So it's very atypical for robins, for instance, or animals at all, to be able to sense magnetic fields. There are other examples and some animals that are able to sense magnetic fields in other kinds of ways, but it's so unusual that it demands an explanation for what exactly the mechanism could be for that. By contrast, the stability of matter case, the genericness of animals and plants not scattering away or dissolving nearly instantaneously, is something that is so typical that it's not really seen to require an explanation at a deeper level. Of course, it's interesting to investigate that, but investigating that question doesn't occasion a new kind of cross-level explanation. You might say, and I'll talk about this a bit more, that the description and explanations at a certain level screen off descriptions and explanations at another level. And we see a similar thing when it comes to the efficiency of photosynthesis. This particular chemical process is unusually and exceptionally efficient. What could explain such a thing when the typical situation is rather inefficient analogous chemical reactions? And here is also where the introduction of a quantum mechanical explanation renders this situation unsurprising, or takes the atypical and renders it expected. So here's the kind of picture that I'm imagining is what's describing here. So there is a behind, I think, the interest in quantum biology implicitly a kind of levels of reality picture, and a kind of idea of screening off of explanations. I just want to emphasize here that I'm not providing an argument for why we should believe in such a leveled structure, or what reasons we have to expect that explanations should be screened off in this sort of way. I'm just giving what I take to be a reconstruction of some of the underlying kind of like metaphysical or proto-metaphysical attitude that drives these sorts of interest in this. So at the level of biology, we have biological phenomena, migration and photosynthesis. At the level of classical chemistry, we've got magnetic effects and we have electron transport. And in quantum mechanics, we have quantum mechanical phenomena, coherence, tunneling, and many others. Um, Now, what's typically going to be the case is that we imagine that if we want to explain a whole class of biological phenomena, like photosynthesis, for instance, we might do so by explaining it via chemical properties. And if we want to explain a whole set of chemical phenomena, such as electron transport using quantum mechanics, we might do so. Um, and what's typically the case is that we don't need to reach down into a deeper level in this level of reality picture in order to provide an adequate explanation. An explanation, in other words, that renders the thing to be explained expected. And what's unusual in these sorts of cases, and what I think is characterizing quantum biology, is exactly this: a set of biological phenomena, the adequate explanation of which, an explanation, in other words, that renders the phenomena expected, is one that doesn't just rest in classical chemistry, but that must go to a deeper level of description or explanation. In other words, it's a situation where chemistry doesn't screen off the explanations from quantum mechanics. So I have a tentative answer, therefore, based on these sorts of considerations. Quantum biology is a kind of a transdisciplinary research field that's characterized by phenomena at a high level, such as in biology, explanation of which is improved by answering further questions at a lower level, like quantum physics, because explanation only at a higher level doesn't render the phenomena unsurprising or is otherwise unsatisfactory for other sorts of reasons. So it seems to me that quantum biology is not a singular kind of scientific field, but is structured by or characterized by a field which seeks explanations that have this unusual feature. And potentially, there could be other scientific subdisciplines which are characterized in the same way, where the pairs are not quantum physics and biology, but some others, perhaps involving neuroscience and social science. I haven't investigated this question, but I'd be interested in learning from you if you have other examples that you might have in mind. Another feature I think that is nice about this particular answer to the question about what quantum biology is that it makes sense of some episodes in the history of, indeed, quantum biology in the 20th century. My work at this particular point, this pivotal juncture, is a bit sketchy because I've just discovered some of these connections recently, and I'm still trying to investigate the full historical story. But I wanted to sketch it out a little bit for you to show why this particular characterization of quantum biology can be interesting and explain the history of the field. So, in particular, the origin here is indeed a very influential book by Erwin Schrödinger called What is Life? There's a lot of things that are going on in the book, a lot of different proposals. But the one that I want to focus on is a particular proposal that he makes about what the relationship between, for instance, quantum physics might be and genetical material. Um, of course, he famously suggests that genetical material is probably represented in some sort of aperiodic crystal structure. But it's not often recognized as often that he also suggested that the mechanism for, or at least one mechanism for mutation amongst this genetical material could involve quantum tunneling of the components of these aperiodic crystals among each other. In other words, he proposed that a mechanism for evolution might involve quantum mechanics directly. Now, his ideas were taken up in various fashions. The one that I want to focus on is some work by Perlov Lövden, who's within chemistry sometimes known as one of the fathers of quantum chemistry. He's a Swedish physical chemist. And one of the things that he uh, recognized is he appreciated Schrodinger's suggestion and tried to develop more concrete, particular computational models for making predictions for how exactly um, quantum tunneling could affect genetical mutation. Now, he did work on this in the 1960s and 1970s, and you can see here an example of a volume that he edited in the journal, International Journal of Quantum Chemistry on quantum biology and quantum pharmacology. Now, what's interesting about this particular project um, uh, is that there were a lot of interest and a lot of computer simulations and models that were being developed in the 60s and 70s and even a little bit into the 80s that were trying to explain certain aspects of mutation in terms of quantum tunneling. But the program, maybe it suffices to say, kind of fizzled out. And the reason why it seemed like the program fizzled out was that despite um, the theoretical interest in it, biologists just couldn't find any actual mutation phenomenon that couldn't be explained by conventional means. If there was any quantum effects due to tunneling on mutation, for instance, for instance, tunneling of one part of a genome into another part. um, then the effects were so small that they were swamped by other sorts of effects. It became clear that, in fact, there was no exceptional biological phenomena that needed to be explained in a way that didn't make reference just to conventional chemistry and the usual means within biochemistry. So it's interesting because there was enough excitement about this already in the 60s and 70s that Loveton was involved in the founding of a society called the International Society of Quantum Biology and Pharmacology, which it seemed in my historical research so far was very brightly looking to the future as with quantum physics being an essential insight into understanding not just the mechanisms of mutation, but also the mechanisms of drug design as well. Now, it's remarkable that between that time in 1970 and today, there was a realization amongst this community that the quantum mechanical application to these problems wasn't actually explaining anything better than the classical models were. There was no phenomena that it could explain distinctly. And so we see here actually a statement on the ISQBP website here that reflects a total change in what they take their topic to be. It says it's a society founded in 1970 that provides a forum for chemists, pharmacologists, and biologists to discuss and extend the impact of computational methodologies in various fields, including biology, chemistry, and drug discovery. It's really interesting that in the mission statement of this society, the word quantum is not explained or referenced at all. It seems to me that what happened was that at some point the society just kept its name but changed what it saw as its most productive function, which was the promotion of the computational methodologies that were being used by quantum chemists to try to make predictions for what kinds of quantum effects could happen. There's a couple other examples that are like this that I've found in the history of quantum biology. Um, Potential phenomena that quantum mechanics would aim to explain that ended up not having any exceptional features, like in the case of avian magnetoreception, for instance. And so, as a topic within quantum biology, it kind of faded away or fell away. And I think an advantage of my particular account of what characterizes quantum biology is unique is that it's able to capture that history. Now, there's a lot of details of this history that I've yet to explore, and some of you might know more about the history of this society and other developments. And if you do, I'd be very interested in hearing about them and introducing even more nuance into the story. But I think I'll end here and thank you for your kind attention.
I thank you very much, Sam. So let me remind you how we're going to be proceeding. If you have a question, please go to the bottom of your screen. You can see a Q&A button. Write your name right there, and I will promote you to speaker so that you can ask your question directly to Sam. If you are at the center right now, feel free also to do that right center or write it in the chat like Andrea did. Andrea, why don't you start to ask the question? Andrea? Yeah.
All right, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yep.
All right, thanks a lot, Sam, for the talk. I'm Andrea Roselli. So I wanted to know if, so since quantum mechanics is typically taken to be a field in which there is indeterminism, or at least a different kind of determinism, let's say a probabilistic determinism, I was wondering if, in your opinion, there is some sort of problem in this passage between one level to another, and in particular, if these quantum effects, which are typically described as indeterministic or probabilistic, how can they become deterministic at the biological level if there is this sort of transfer problem, or if you think that it's not a problem at all for quantum biology. If you can tell us the reason for that, I'd be interested. Thanks.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So, at the level of description that these quantum chemists are interested in things, the end effects of quantum phenomena involve statistical predictions, probabilistic descriptions for various kinds of phenomena. So, for instance, in this cryptochrome with the radical pair, um, what these graphs that I was showing you with the green curves and the red curves and so on are depicting, you can think of them, if you like, as the probability of a transition to a particular state that signals has a good chance of signaling down the optical nerve. So, what typically happens in these situations is that there's not just one of these molecules that's involved, there's an enormous number of them. And so, if you have a probability distribution over the different outcomes for one of the processes, if you have a large number of them, you get effectively a kind of statistical ensemble of outcomes that is highly reflective in its frequencies with the probability distributions for the different outcomes. So the way that the probabilistic aspects get connected with these processes is through kind of outcomes of a large number of examples of the process. And as anyone who's studied the law of large numbers knows, the larger numbers of these you get, the more and more stable the phenomena gets in its relative proportions. And so, in that limit of having a large number of these molecules, and there's typically quite many in the eyes of these birds, we get a relatively stable proportion of activations and deactivations relative to the bird's orientation to the magnetic field. But it's really important for this to work that there is like a lot of cryptochrome in the eyes of the birds. Because if there were only a few, even if it were very sensitive, there would be a lot more small sample effects with the variability of the sort that you were alluding to in your concern. So that's how I see the issue being ameliorated.
Thanks, Sam. Could you get out of the close your PowerPoint so that we can
Oh,
actually,
yes, of course.
yeah. Siddharth, why don't you ask your question? Thanks. And then Alex.
Hi, Sam. Nice to see you.
You too.
So I'm sure you're aware that there is a somewhat similar debate that happens in quantum computing, where someone comes up with a quantum device or a device that's claimed to be quantum, and there's a question about whether it really implements a quantum computation or not. And often that device is certainly using a whole bunch of quantum phenomena, but then there's a sort of a computational level of description. And the question is always whether a classical algorithm might be able to do the same task at faster or at the same rate as this proposed device.
Yeah.
And I perhaps missed this a little bit in your talk, but your suggestion is that that kind of definition is not a good one in the quantum biology case. And the sort of reason you gave, if I remember correctly, was about you can't quite interpret biological systems as performing tasks. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I think that that's part of the issue, and I think that even if we could characterize them in that sort of way, um,
Mhm.
there is there is the issue that it seems that what's required is not just some hypothetically more efficient way of doing
Right.
things. like in the photosynthesis case, which I think is pretty analogous in certain
Mm.
respects to the quantum computing case. But there has to be some biological phenomena that needs to be explained in doing so. And in the case of computing, what we would need is we would need to have some computing phenomena. I guess the analogy would be something like some sort of algorithm or machine which is just performing more efficiently than we could otherwise characterize things by. And in the in the genetics case, for instance, it could well be actually that there is no um, process that a full characterization of mutation rates ultimately will require
Mm.
the use of quantum mechanics. It's just that the geneticists just haven't actually been able to identify any component which is not sufficiently swamped by noise that they need to you invoke any quantum mechanical phenomena for. So I
Yeah.
think a big difference with the classical with the computing case, therefore, has to do with the idea that quantum biology is not just an engineering task, but it's really a
Yeah.
task that's involved in describing and explaining nature. And I think that that's in other words one of the essential differences in this particular case.
Okay, yeah, that's helpful. Yeah, so I was also thinking that that's the key point is that simply the set of possible compute ways you could perform that same task is not quite as relevant in the biology case because in the computation case, you might think, well, why would I invest in this project because I could just do it on my laptop? Whereas here, the question is what is actually happening in the biological system? And
Yeah,
so that sort of
that
actualistic explanation is relevant, right? Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. And I think that sometimes in scientists' own description of what they're doing, this does get mixed up a little bit because they often do want to appeal to funders of their research who are interested in engineering applications of these sorts of ideas. So it can
Hmm.
be in some of the descriptions hard to entangle, but I see these two as being kind of separate things.
Okay, thanks.
Mhm.
Thanks, Idas. Alex, why don't you join us?
Yeah, thanks a lot. You asked for examples of quantum neuroscience, so I wanted to give one. I'm almost sure you know it. It's not a very successful theory apparently, but it is a theory. Stuart Hamroff and Penrose theory of consciousness was meant to be a theory that invoked quantum effects to explain something that seemed very weird, like consciousness. And in the same vein, following on Andrea's question, quantum biology might give hope to some libertarians who argue that free will depends on some kind of non-deterministic causation, and who think that quantum mechanics allows us to make sense of this kind of causation. So
Yeah, that has been a hope for a long time that somehow failure of determinism would provide means for free will, although it seems like it's just as worse, or it's just as bad rather, for that. But I do take the point that this could be an example of an analogous sort of phenomenon where we don't have the kind of screening off of explanations by levels. Um, Now, with the hammer off in Penrose thing, I have to confess I've never really studied what the theory is, and so I think because I thought maybe I would just be wasting my time, but the fact that you pointed out makes it seem to me like maybe I ought to look at it as to see whether it is really indeed an example like this, whether it's successful or not.
yeah, I think it fits the bill as an example of quantum neuroscience, but I think it's not very successful, and
Yeah,
no one really. I mean, it's not really taken seriously.
yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. Connor, floor is yours, and then Carl.
Fantastic. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. Thanks so much for organizing this and for the talk, Samuel. Yeah, I've been trying to get around this stuff on my own a little bit, so it's been very interesting to get some of this. Now, I'm not a philosopher of science, so forgive any ignorance here, but one thing I wanted to ask about was whether or not we can think about quantum biology, maybe in terms of how it poses a challenge to previous thinking about demarcating between things like physics and biology as separable levels. I know that's something you said you didn't want to commit to in the talk, but I wanted to raise this because I mean it seems, and I think this is Matt and Al Khalili say this as well, that it was often thought that life was just too hot and too wet to accommodate quantum biologic phenomena, and so I think the example they give on this is like the enzymatic proton transfer that was often thought to be non-quantum, and then you have the work of someone like Judith Klinman. And yeah, not to get bogged down in examples, but basically the idea that life maybe depends on quantum biologic phenomenon in some specific instances, as maybe challenging those old divisions between physics and biology, as between the cold and the dry and the wet and the hot, basically. And so, yeah, I just wanted to hear your sort of reflections on that idea as an approach to defining quantum biology, or any thoughts you have at the moment on that. Thanks again.
Yeah, it's a very good question. I take the references to too hot and wet to be a concrete expression of this idea that I was saying before, the underlying commitment to the idea that we think that we have a kind of an explanatory screening off. When they're saying it's too hot and too wet, they're describing a way in which it's entirely expected that you would take quantum effects to be screened off from biological ones. The hot and wet is supposed to give you the circumstances under which all of the explanations from quantum stuff to biology would just go through classical explanations, because the idea being that that's the regime in which classical physics is well approximating quantum physics, and so we don't get any added explanatory benefit from trying to give a quantum an explanation based in quantum phenomena or quantum physics. Now, whether this challenges the idea of the separation of levels itself, I think it's going to depend on your theory of levels. I don't think it's necessarily the case. So if you think that the separation between levels doesn't require there to be um, um, substantive explanatory relations that reach across several levels, because, for instance, you might think that explanation is a human activity that's done by people with all of their cognitive limitations, and therefore the goodness of explanations is reflective of the kind of cognitive goals of explanation, among others. Whereas you might think that the levels themselves are characterized in some more metaphysical sense, right? In that way, you could still have levels of reality, but it would still be the case that in order to explain some phenomena at some level might require or to explain it fully adequately might require reaching down into a deeper level than you might have originally expected. Now, if you had a characterization of levels that really depended on them being explanatorily separated from one another, so if you defined levels in this way, then I agree with you that it would challenge that characterization. And I try not to make any commitment about that one way or another here.
That's really helpful. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for joining us. Carl, floor is yours.
Hi. Unfortunately, between the question of Siddharth and Connor, basically, you've already addressed what I was interested in, which is about the sense in which the classical stories are good enough, and I was puzzled by why wouldn't you still want to do a quantum sort of treatment of a lot of biological mechanisms, just because you think it has got to be more accurate, more correct, even if in some explanatory sense the classical thing is perfectly satisfying. But I think you've already addressed it basically.
Yeah, and I think maybe I can just add that having this kind of explanatory screening off is not supposed to be an objection to the project of understanding how classical physics emerges as a limit of quantum physics or can be explained by quantum physics. It has rather to do with when we have the sort of phenomena that quantum biology is interested in, we have features of explanations that are made substantially better by reaching down that are particular, right? So they're unexpected features. This is why I keep using this example, as flippant as it is, of the stability of matter. Like, in order to explain how matter is stable, we need to invoke quantum theory, but that's like a generic feature, not just of all living things, but of all matter in general. And even though it's interesting to ask that question, it seems to me that what characterizes quantum biology is a focus on things that are unexpected or atypical or exceptional, and therefore require reaching down in order to explain that atypicality, right? Um, which is not to say that the other project, right, is not something worthwhile. It just seems like that's just not what quantum biology is involved in.
Thanks. I'm going to be repeating the question in the chat, and because the speaker does not want to be joining as a panelist, it's more a comment or it's a question. So let me read it for you. Some South Korean researchers found a way to revert cancerous cells to normal cells utilizing nanotechnologies that involve quantum phenomena.
Yeah, I don't know the example, and so I can't really judge. I would suspect probably not. Most work in um, the application of nanoscience to the biological sciences and bioengineering doesn't involve quantum mechanical effects in the usual sense. It rather characterizes a kind of unusual domain for physical objects that occurs at the nanoscale. That is very interesting in itself, but it's usually not characterized in a quantum mechanical way.
So I'll take the opportunity to ask a question or make a comment. I think it's really an interesting question about how to understand what makes an interdisciplinary field interdisciplinary, and I really like the idea of focusing on the nature of the explanations that are required to make surprising phenomena less surprising or satisfactorily understood, maybe. Yeah. And it was not clear, and I'm not sure you will interpret it this way, whether you meant your answer to apply to every interdisciplinary field or just to the case of quantum biology or maybe to a subset. And I was looking for interdisciplinary fields that look quite different from the one you are describing. And the one that came to mind was neuroeconomics. And neuroeconomics, it's not quite clear that neuroscientific theories provide explanation for classical or economic phenomena. And at the very least, it's not quite clear that we have this surprising economic phenomena that become unsurprising somehow when you look at neuroimaging data. What seems to be going on in neuroeconomics, I'm not an expert. It's a an outsider perspective, is that the phenomena of explanations themselves happen to have been redefined. And it's more observing new phenomena that are in some sense connected with economic behavior and providing neuroscientific explanation for those phenomena, rather than having this passing the buck strategy that you were describing in your example. So I don't know whether it's a correct description of neuroeconomics. I don't know enough about the field, but from the outside, it seems to be quite different from the one you're describing here. So just for your thoughts.
Yeah, that from the way that you describe it, that sounds right to me. And I certainly don't want to suggest that the structure of how quantum biology is characterized is typical of interdisciplinary fields at all. I just found that the exact structure here seems to me just personally just very interesting, and one that I think that hasn't been adequately explored in the philosophy of scientific interdisciplinarity. And so it's an open question to me what the whole map of interdisciplinarity is. What exactly are the relationships that characterize interdisciplinary fields? This is one of them, and I suspect that there are others which are distinct.
Cool, thanks. Margarita.
Thank you. Hi, Sam. That was very interesting. And I wanted to, I think, dispute the claim about how organisms are not properly seen as executing tasks and as being more or less efficient. I think that on the contrary, there's a perfectly acceptable naturalistic account of functions in biology in terms of their evolved effects. And I do think that organisms are quite often under selection for efficiency, and especially so when in matters of energy, which of course photosynthesis is an example of. So I do think that if there is a more efficient way of, in this case, capturing energy from sunlight, then you would expect plants to be under selection for being more efficient and possibly making it more likely that they would find it.
Yeah, basically, I concede the point. I think that that sounds right to me. In the context of the paper, it seems that the functional thinking is definitely relevant for thinking about like the engineering applications that might come from these sorts of developments. And so I think my criticism of that particular characterization of quantum biology needs to lean on some of the other things that I said rather than the criticism that I gave. So I take the point.
Good, yeah. I had a very similar question, so I'm glad Margarita raised it. Any other question or comments at this time? People at the center? No, I don't see anyone raising their hands. People among yes, Diane.
See what's coming.
Oh, Lucy.
Yeah, I'll just ask a quick question. So I've just written on my page, what about chemistry? And you did touch on this. But I guess I'm curious about whether there are cases of, so examples of what we would call quantum biology that don't include a description of the kind of chemical middle of the sandwich, if you like. So are they all looking at sort of statistical ensembles of quantum systems? Yeah, does that make sense as a question? Do we have any cases where we're looking at quantum biology with no quantum chemistry or no biochemistry involved?
That is a good question. I don't think that I know of any examples that could be unequivocally characterized in that way. It wouldn't involve chemistry or biochemistry as a kind of intermediate, because indeed, in the way that I've characterized things, it seems rather important, because it's got to be the case that the chemical or the biochemical explanation is somehow inadequate or doesn't render unsurprising the phenomena to be explained. Now, a possibility could be that there's like some other level here that's in between them even further. That might be so. What could it be though? I think it would answering this question would involve like, you know, looking at a lot of the details of particular examples, but there's nothing obvious that comes to mind. If you do think of one though, please let me know. I would be interested.
Thanks. and Lucy. Alia, floor is yours. And then Maddie also has a question. Alia, go for it.
Yeah, thank you for your talk. I'm wondering about the case of interlevel explanations in cognitive neuroscience. It seems to me like often we have a sort of purely cognitive functional description of performance on a task in cognitive neuroscience. And that's taken to be an invitation for an implementational style explanation, right? One that looks for like a neural structural realization of that functional activity. And that's a case where we're moving from one level, arguably a level down, right? And that's not motivated by distinctive explanation in the same way that, we don't have an adequate explanation for phenomenon at the level above. But it's just taken that, there's something we gain by going down a level and getting an implementational explanation. And so I was wondering why the quantum biology had to meet this higher standard where we don't have an adequate explanation at the level above. And that's why we have to go a level down, right? In some cases, it seems like quantum biology can meet that higher standard. But I think often, for example, in cognitive neuroscience, we wouldn't meet that higher standard for going a level down. So I wonder, I'm just trying to compare these two cases.
What do you mean by that, by a higher standard?
The higher standard just being that we don't have an adequate explanation at the level above, and that's why we need to go down to the lower level to get an adequate explanation there. And in case of cognitive neuroscience, we have an adequate explanation at the higher level, and nevertheless, we go a level down to look for more explanation.
Yeah, I wonder whether these sorts of examples are similar to examples where one has some biological phenomena that one then, whose explanation you think is adequate, that also you have a biochemical kind of analysis of it. And in that sort of case, I don't see that the desire for looking for the biochemical explanation is coming from any perceived deficiency necessarily in the higher level explanation, more so motivated by the idea that these different scientific disciplines bear upon one another. And if they do concern overlapping subjects and overlapping phenomena, then somehow their explanations need to interface with one another. I think this is similar to Edouard's question, or related to Edouard's question from before, where these sorts of interdisciplinary explanations don't have the same, or interdisciplinary fields don't have the same structure as quantum biology. It seems to me that like what's really characterizing quantum biology, like what's giving its like identity conditions, if you will, is that it's really concerned with um, explanations that are only made adequate by going to an even deeper level, not just one level lower, but even a level even lower than that. Which is not to say that sciences that don't do that are somehow deficient in any sort of way. It's just that the explanations that they're examining just have a different sort of structure, or what's holding together those disciplines is some other collection of concerns rather than the sort of concerns that we find in quantum biology.
Thank you.
Yep.
Right. Thanks, Sam. Maddie, floor is yours.
Hello, Samuel. Thank you for your talk.
Mhm.
I'm wondering if different interpretations of quantum mechanics is of relevance here, because you talked about levels of reality. And so what's the nature of that level at the quantum level? If is it kind of mathematical aspect of quantum mechanics that is important here in understanding the level of reality at the quantum level? Or is it more about the interpretation that we have about reality? And then in this second case, different interpretations of quantum mechanics would be of relevance. Thank you.
Yeah. I think that the aspects of quantum mechanics that are invoked here are things that any adequate interpretation of quantum mechanics is going to share, or at least approximately, because they all of them concern the predictions that the theory makes for ensembles of identical or nearly identical systems. And this is the kind of, if you don't mind the phrase, the kind of the operational or empirical content of quantum mechanics. And even though some interpretations of quantum theory, vary a little bit what the predictions are, like how collapse theories, for instance, have slightly different predictions depending on the collapse parameter than standard quantum mechanics or Everettian quantum mechanics or Bohmian quantum mechanics. These differences are, if they want to capture what's been empirically successful with the theory, it seems that they've got to capture nearly the same things, or if not exactly the same things. So it doesn't seem to me yet that this particular question is one where the interpretation of quantum mechanics makes a difference for understanding what quantum biology is. But I'm open to some examples that seem like they show otherwise. It seems to me that the examples I've looked at so far aren't of that character.
Thanks, Sam. Any other question? The center, the attendees? 1, 2, 3, as you say in in some places. All right, very good. I think we will stop here. Thanks for joining us, Sam. It's been a real pleasure as usual to listen to you. See you next week, maybe for Clark's Glimmer's talk, and otherwise. Bye, I guess. Ciao, Sam.
Thanks, everyone.
And thanks again. Bye.
Yeah, thank you, everyone, for your great discussion.